Welcome to everyone from all around the country, it appears, and anyone who is also joining us from anywhere around the world. I'm happy to be with you this afternoon. Looking forward to what I hope will be an engaging conversation about intercultural competence and also a little bit of practice on kind of building our own intercultural competence. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to first say thanks to our good colleagues from SPA behind the scenes who are helping us out to make this webinar happen, and to everyone who played such an important role in putting all of this event together, and for all of you for taking the time, especially for our students who are officially off today, for taking the time to expand your knowledge. I'm impressed. I think I would be doing something else entirely when I was a student. So I'm really grateful that you all are here and looking forward to our time together. So to kick us off, let me just quickly talk about some norms, some ideas. I'm noticing a lot of folks have cameras off, which is totally fine. I know many of us are experiencing serious Zoom fatigue in this moment, and I appreciate that very much, but also want to welcome you to turn your camera on if you'd like to. And if, again, you can turn it off and on as you need to over the course of today's conversation. So that is sort of one norm that we can have for each other. We're going to talk a little bit about how we interact together. So it's sometimes useful, at least later when we do some skill building, to be able to see each other. And it's never the same as being in person, for sure. But I think there's some important pieces around reading body language, even virtually, that are helpful that we can do when we're seeing each other. But again, no judgment at all. Understand all the reasons why folks would want to keep your cameras off. So a welcome, but not a mandate by any means, without judgment. And the second thing I'll do is just say, as always, when we enter these kinds of conversations, talking about issues of culture, cultural difference, cultural sameness, the ways that these show up in our own lives and the lives of others, I like to kind of lay out just a few norms for our conversations together that I hope that we can follow, and that will be both for how we talk to each other when we do talk live, which I would encourage you to feel free to use the hand raise button throughout our call, or to speak out if you'd like to ask questions. That's fine with me along the way. If you just want to unmute and ask a question, no problem at all. If you'd like to use the chat box, that's another wonderful way to chat in. You can chat to everyone, or if you'd like to privately chat to me, please feel free to do that. But a couple of norms just for our conversation, and I'll only throw out a few, is I hope we will all do a couple of things. One is to really work to listen for understanding, right? I know that we're all here because you have decided to be. That's pretty exciting. And I think that means that you're all kind of eager to learn some of these concepts and to learn together with others. So let's agree to listen for understanding, which is, instead of trying to make a point, right, trying to really hear what other folks are saying or suggesting. But the second thing is to say, sometimes, and we'll talk about this today, there are going to be moments when we are not heard, when we feel hurt or maybe harmed. That can happen in these conversations. And I think we want to sort of name that. And another norm for conversations around these is often trust intent, but name impact, which is to say, we are here because we want to be and we want to learn. But that doesn't mean the impact of what we might say or type or do couldn't land wrong with someone. And so we do want to also make space and welcome and encourage folks, if something lands wrong with you, to please lift that up and know that it will be heard and appreciated for that, so that we can all continue to grow in developing our capacity to sort of hear each other and see each other more fully. And that's part of what intercultural confidence, in fact, is about. So that will be our second norm. And our third will be to speak using I statements, right? A lot of times when we're talking about culture, issues of power, race, gender identity, other kinds of conversations, these move a lot more smoothly when we speak about in I statements, how I perceive this, how I read this, what's true for me. And instead of talking about you or they, or this is how they might interpret or experience things. So I think when we speak for ourselves, we can have much more productive conversations around these topics. So before I kind of move into introducing myself and jumping into the session, I would invite anybody who is here to offer another thought, another idea. If there's other ways you like to interact in these conversations, feel free to pop it in the chat. feel free to speak it out loud. You can raise your hand and I can call on you, whatever's comfortable for you. So I'll just hold a little space for folks. Any other norms you'd like to put forward for how we can have a productive session this afternoon?
Hi, everyone. My name is Daniel, and Dr. Taylor, thank you for hosting this today.
Hi,
I suppose
Daniel,
one thing
welcome.
just one thing that I'm thinking of, and it's not well thought out right now, but it's just putting everything into context and just recognizing, again, just the emotional elements of some of this work, and recognizing that a lot of folks have been feeling very isolated recently and may have thoughts and things that are in their head that they haven't been able to articulate in a space or really process with other folks. So just trying to figure, just have, give some grace there, that there's a lot happening, that people are constantly receiving messages through media, but some of it's unfiltered, and just trying to recognize the world that we're living in and how people are entering the space as well.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. I appreciate that. I thank you for saying that. I hear you. We are in truly a time, I think, unlike any other, at least in recent history. And you're right, there we are all navigating in different ways and to different levels of intensity this moment. And so I think the idea of grace is an important one. And I like how you framed that. And grace being the way we sort of hold space for each other to be human, I think, right? I don't know if that's a translation of what you're saying, but holding space for each other to be a little off maybe in this moment, right? And to be working. Sometimes a language frame that we use sometimes in these conversations is, I'm working in first draft here, right? That can be a useful tool. Is I heard this from a colleague, Becca Coughlin. I don't know if any of you know Becca. She works in SIS, the School of International Service. And anyway, it's a phrase she uses a lot, and I've really appreciated is, when you're sort of, there's something you need to say, but maybe it's not as fully fleshed out and it might land wrong, but you kind of you're calling for a little grace to say, I'm working in first draft, can be a nice way to sort of enact, I think, that spirit that you've lifted up.
That's perfect. I love that. Thank you.
Yeah, Becca Coughlin. All right. Anyone else want to add a norm or an idea for kind of how we want to be with each other today? Again, feel free to speak it out. You can put it in the chat if that's more comfortable for you. Okay. All right, so we'll talk about the idea of silence and wait time as actually a culturally responsive tool. It can feel weird for some of us who, from certain cultures where that feels awkward, right? For others, that can feel respectful, right? So we'll talk about that idea of wait time. I'm going to try to sort of talk through even some of the techniques that I'll be trying to sort of model as we move along, and we'll kind of flag them that way. All right, so without further ado, let me introduce myself, which I haven't fully done yet. I know some of you on this call, but not all. So I'll be sure to at least tell you who I am and what I'm doing here. So my name is Amanda Taylor, and I use she, her, hers pronouns. And I have sort of two hats at AU. I've been here a long time, on and off. I'm someone who has never in my heart left AU and has come back many times in different roles. I started out as a staff member many, many years ago in the School of International Service, and then was able to come back actually after getting my doctorate as a faculty member in the School of International Service, where I had the honor to direct a master's program called the Master's Program in International and Intercultural Communication. And that's a program in which we talk a lot about these issues of intercultural competence and how they show up in areas of diplomacy, international education, international development, international business. And so that was sort of a lot of what I was able to sort of learn with students about and do for several years at AU. And now I'm in a role at AU for the past few years, the Assistant Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at AU, which is a I always say to my students, this is like my practicum. This is where I got to try and apply all the stuff I used to yammer on about, try to make it happen, try to make it real. And so I've been working with incredible colleagues across campus, many of whom are on this call, to really collectively advance our goals for inclusive excellence. So how do we build the collaborations we need to do the work for inclusive excellence? So that's me. And before we jump in, I also want to just say that as much as I've studied this stuff and practiced this stuff, I very much consider myself a learner. I'm always learning. I'm always stumbling, and have been really grateful to have had the space and chance to continue to learn about these issues. And I think it's really important to learn how to be humble in this work, because no matter how much we think we know, there's far more that we don't. And it for me is this work is really a process of learning and unlearning simultaneously. And so after I list all these things I've done, I want to make very, very clear that doesn't mean that I'm perfect at this. And I don't think that's a thing. I don't think that's a thing we should strive for. I don't think it's useful. I think what we want to be is intentional. And so I try to be intentional about this, but let me be real clear, I stumble all the time. And I'm very, very grateful for colleagues around campus and around the world, and others who've been on the journey sort of with me as we continue to learn. So I will stop there and just kind of jump into our content for today. In fact, although you know what, there are, I think, few enough on this call that we could maybe take a chance for just some quick introductions. I think we've got some time. So let me go ahead and ask folks maybe to quickly go around, say your name, your pronouns if you're comfortable, your relationship to AU. I know we probably have staff, faculty, students. I saw some alumni signed up. So how are you connected to parents, family members, maybe? How are you connected to AU? And then maybe just one or two words about what brought you here today, right? So why are you here? What are you hoping to think through this afternoon? So I'm going to go ahead and call on folks the way that I see them on my screen. And I think in Zoom space, that makes these a little bit easier as we navigate it. So apologies in advance if I can't read your name clearly, but I'm going to take my best shot and move as I see folks on my screen. So the first person I see is Jacqueline. Jacqueline, would you share with us your name, your pronouns if you're comfortable, relationship to AU, and what brought you here today?
Hello, everyone. My name is Jacqueline Bracero, she, her, hers. And I recently graduated with a master's in global media this just past summer. And I'm interested in learning more about how to better interact with people, especially of different cultures.
Great. Thanks, Jacqueline. Congrats on graduation, global media program. Good, a cousin of the IC program at SIS. Congrats. Next, I see Marcy.
Hi, everybody. My name is Marcy Campos, and I work on campus. Well, when we're the Center for Community Engagement and Service, I'm the director. So through our programs, we prepare students to work in DC, in nonprofits, with young people, and also globally. And I think it's so important that the intercultural competency is a strong part of our preparation because there's so much disparity and so much diversity in DC, and I want to make sure our students feel equipped and, respectful and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, I've probably taken this workshop before with Amanda, but it's a refresher.
I know, right? Y'all, some of y'all know my tricks. I got to get some new tricks out of my bag. Thank you, Marcy. Appreciate it. Next, I see Gihan.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gihan Fernando. I had the University Career Center. Pronouns are he, him, his. I will come to anything that Amanda does. So that's why I'm here. And I'm sure I will learn more in the work that we do in the Career Center. Issues of communication broadly and intercultural communication in particular are really important. And so I'm always looking to learn more about that. And for any of the students in the room who haven't taken advantage of the Career Center, just know that we are all there for you. Okay, and very interested in helping you. I know we have others in the room who are from other career centers on campus, like Daniel. So anyway, I've gone on for too long. I'll shut up now.
No shutting up, and I'll pay Gihan later for the shout out as well. But I appreciate the infomercial. Nice work. Thank you. And next up, I see Daniel.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. On the East Coast here, my name is Daniel D. Hollander. My pronouns are he, him, and his. And as Gihan mentioned, I work in the Office of Career Engagement, so the Career Center for within Kogod School of Business. I have been at American University now for about 8 years, previously in residence life. And that's part of the reason that I'm here today is I felt like in residence life, as a part of the OCL, Office of Campus Life team, we engage in these conversations quite often. And now that we are in a virtual setting, now that I am in a career services role, I want to re-engage in this conversation and think about everything in context. So I appreciate the perspectives folks will share today and appreciate the time to be here with you all.
Great. Thanks, Daniel. Appreciate it. All right, Molly, I see up next.
Hi, everyone. My name is Molly Madison. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I graduated from AU from the School of International Service in 2016. And I'm really interested to be here today because I actually work in a very cross-cultural setting. I've lived and worked in a bunch of different countries before, but I think you can never sharpen your skills too much. So I'm excited to see what we talk about here.
Great. Thanks, Molly. Congrats. Glad you're here. Welcome all of our alumni back. Love that. All right. Next up, I see Farouz.
Hi. Sorry, I've moved to the floor here.
I appreciate that. And I hope that I pronounced your name correctly, Farouz.
Yeah, Farouz is fine. Thank you. So yeah, my name is Farouz Kadane, and I work with CSES along with Marcy. Fairly new to campus, but have been getting really well acquainted with all the different work going on campus and kind of more so in the DC kind of greater DC area in terms of grassroots work and local activism. And I think that this topic is really important to that work, and it's always evolving. So it's really great to constantly kind of get the new insights. So excited to be here.
All right. Well, welcome belated to AU and glad you're with us. Thanks so much. Okay, next up I see Caroline.
Hi, I'm Caroline, she, her, hers. I graduated with my undergrad in 2014, and I currently work with a fellowship program. So we have international, well, we used to have international fellows all the time, but at the moment that's kind of on hold for obvious reasons, but it's always good to learn how I can be better, so.
Great, all right. More alum in the house. Thank you, Caroline, appreciate that. Miranda.
Hi, everyone. My name is Miranda, she, her, hers. I graduated in 2017 and I work in the alumni office. Just couldn't get enough AU.
I hear that.
And I joined today because I have heard you speak in the past, Dr. Taylor, and everything I have heard, I've always really enjoyed. And so when I saw that you were doing this programming, I was really excited to join. So just here to learn more.
Oh my gosh, so many people I had to pay off before this call. Thank you, Miranda. I will be giving out my wonderful thank yous later on. I'm just kidding. All right, thanks, Miranda. Glad you're here. All right, McLaren.
Hi, I'm McLaren Skanes. My pronouns are she, hers, her. My relationship to AU, I'm a freshman this year and I'm studying international studies. I'm hoping to have a regional focus in the Middle East and a lingual focus in Arabic. Eventually I want to work in the Middle East. So definitely I want to learn about cultures and how I can assimilate myself into cultures respectfully. I love learning about cultures, and I think this call will be great for me to learn how to learn about cultures, prepare myself better for that.
Cool, thank you. Go SIS. And you will take, I'm sure, intercultural relations. So this might be a little preview for you. I'm glad you're here. Welcome, Victoria.
Hi, everybody. My name is Victoria. My pronouns are she, her, hers. What brought me here today is also to learn more about communicating effectively with others, especially in an area that is so, like, university setting is already very international and very culturally diverse, and DC is even more so. So I just want to continue learning. Thank you.
Right. Well, welcome, Victoria. Glad to have you. And last but certainly not least, Yunji. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Yes, that's correct. I go by EJ. So,
EJ.
yeah.
Okay, welcome.
So I'm a MBA student and I'm graduating this December. And I'm a Korean American, so I just want to learn how to apply and leverage my cultural background or educational background to real workspace.
Cool. Well, thank you. Congrats on the almost graduation. You're almost there. You're going to make it. We are all behind you. You will join all these alumni on this call quite soon. Congrats. And make sure you connect with Daniel if you haven't already, right, Daniel? I'll do a shout out for you around the Career Center. Great. Well, welcome everyone. Glad you're here. This is a really fun group. I will do my best to kind of adapt what I've got so that it can really respond to, I think, where many of you are with this work. And again, as we move through, please stop me as I'm sharing my screen. I can't see the chat super well. So if you want to just speak up and ask a question or ask me to repeat something, please feel free. I won't feel interrupted. So feel free to just speak out if you need me to clarify anything at any point. I'll also take a pause at certain points and just stop and ask for questions in those moments as well, which you can say out or you can put in the chat if that's easier. Okay, so let me kind of jump in here. I'm gonna share my PowerPoint. There we go. Present this thing. Okay. Would someone say out loud, yes, if you can see this?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. All right. So our goals for today are to really kind of go over a couple of things. And one is kind of just to define our terms, right? What is intercultural competence? And to even talk about intercultural competence, we've got to be able to talk about what is culture, right? And we don't have a ton of time to go into all of the varied definitions of culture. There's many ways to think about it, but I want to at least kind of lay a loose foundation for those two concepts. What's culture and what is intercultural competence, right? Then the second piece I want to make sure we dig into is why does it matter? The so what of this, right? It's nice and everything, but why is it something we should care about? Why is it something employers care about in particular? And why is it something that's sort of important, I think, for our nation, for our world, for our communities? How does intercultural competence sort of help us build and rebuild what is a really torn fabric, I think, in many ways. And then we're going to spend time towards the end of today starting to work on some skill building. So I've got an activity to really start on some of the house. All right, what does it look like to kind of build our intercultural competence? And we'll move through a quick activity in partners to practice some of this stuff. So just to get us started, I think this thing works for me here. There we go. Before we dive in, I want to say a word on this concept of competence, right? I will tell you honestly, I hate it. I don't like the concept of competence, and I'll tell you why. I put this sort of badge on the left side here. I think way too often when we think about things like intercultural competence, it feels like a badge, right? It feels like something that you get, and once you've got it, you're good. I can hear many of you on the call talking about ongoing learning, and that's, I think, exactly the more useful frame. But I think we have to always be aware of the way that concepts like competence are very slippery ideas, right? It sounds fixed, it sounds final. And the work of intercultural competence, the way I see it, is much more akin to what the image I put on the left here, which, or sorry, on the right here, which is really this combination of learning, practicing, and improving, right? This sort of continual process of doing that over and over again. So another thing I want to say before we dig in, I'm going to talk today about culture largely, right? And culture, I want to be very, very clear, operates in the context of power relations, all right? So culture does not happen in a vacuum. We talk about cultural difference and sameness when we talk about intercultural competence, and that's really important sort of as the first framing for understanding, but I want to really set out right now that none of this happens outside of a vacuum of a social, political, global context in which power relations are not even, right? Every quote unquote cultural group does not have the same sort of access to resources. Different cultural expressions are not in a kind of power context, all understood as equally valid and valuable, even though they in fact are, right? So I want to just sort of name this in the very, very beginning that when we talk about intercultural competence, it's one piece of the conversation. The second piece, if we had a part two, right, what we would do is put this in conversations with questions of power, right? And talk about the struggle for culture, whose cultural ideas and whose cultural presentations and practices and preferences and values are given more privilege, right? And whose are silenced and erased, right? And what does that struggle sort of mean and look like? So that is a whole very, very important dimension of conversations that are really, really necessary. We can take our discussion in whatever way y'all want to go today, but we're going to hone in first on this concept of intercultural competence, remembering, please, though, that like culture as it operates is in a power context, all right? But that's going to be kind of the backdrop for our conversation today. So I want to flag that. And again, welcome anyone who wants to start to kind of engage some of these intersections, to ask questions about that, to probe and push in those conversations. I think as Daniel, I think, alluded to earlier, you know, we are in a moment when you could call, in some ways, what we're seeing in our sort of political landscape in the US, but also around the world, clashes of culture. But I think those are clashes of culture in the context of power. Right. And so just sort of naming that and knowing that there are ways that we can kind of dig into this conversation in different ways moving forward. Okay, so to kick us off, you know, what the heck is this concept of culture? Like, what is it? What do people mean when they say it? How does it make sense for us? And I want to kick us off with a little bit of an activity as we do that. Okay. So I'm going to, I hope you all have had a chance to use a poll everywhere before. I'm going to ask you to do a poll everywhere for me. And I'm going to say this out loud, and then I'm going to try and copy and paste it into the chat. But if you're sitting on your computer, you can do this by opening a new window. If you're on your phone, you can do this through text. I think the easiest way is to do it on the computer. But if you could go to Poll Everywhere, POLLEV.com/Amanda Taylor 568. Okay, so POLLEV.com/Amanda Taylor 568. All right. So I'm gonna give you a second to do that. POLLEverywhere.com/Amanda Taylor 568. Okay. Once you got that, you should see a question, which is, what one word do you associate with the concept of culture? So when you hear this word culture, thank you, Daniel, appreciate that. When you hear this word culture, what comes to your mind, right? What's the first thing, the first other word that you associate with that? All right. So I'm going to give us a minute to start to enter. Don't worry about thinking too hard. I see Gihan's got his thinking face on. What what comes to your mind? So enter and
Trouble accessing your thing.
oh no, you are. Okay.
Well, I'll figure it out. Don't worry.
You can also pop it in the chat, Gihan, if you want to. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen and show a word cloud that's going to show us some of the things that are emerging as we chat. Okay. So you should be able to see as folks are entering words, here are the ones that are coming up most commonly. So we're seeing traditions. It's big because it means it's sort of more prominent, right? So more of you have said that word, traditions. We've got language, we've got food, we've got travel, right? We've got, that's to me, those sort of fall in a category, right? Traditions, language, travel, food. Then we've got some other concepts, this idea of variety, right? There's lots of cultures, that's right. We've got this concept of society. Their cultures are very connected to society. We've got this idea of mutual, which is interesting. I think, what do we want to do maybe with culture, right? Or how is it shared? How is culture shared? That's a feature of culture for sure. We've got this concept of understanding, right? That culture is about shared understanding. I'll put those kind of frames together. We've got this idea of the arts, right? To me, that sort of fits with food and traditions, even language as well. And I love this idea of legacy. I think that's really interesting. This concept of legacy, which is to say maybe what is passed down, what is inherited. Great. All right. So we're going to stop sharing that. Thank you. You all pulled out really beautifully lots of the features, right, of a classic definition of culture. So I want to take a couple of minutes just to kind of hone in on a few of those definitions of culture so that we're all kind of talking together on the same page about what we mean by culture. All right, so when we talk about culture, the things that we mean, current slide, there we go. We talk about culture is the way of life. This is Gary Weaver, who many of you might know was a faculty member in SIS and for many years, I think 45 years actually, until he passed a few years ago. But he is sort of a key thought leader in the world of intercultural and cross-cultural communication. And he defined culture as the way of life, right? Someone who said traditions. I think about the way of life, the things we do, right? Language, the things we use are of a group of people. That's the shared part, right? Passed down from one generation to the next. That's the legacy piece you all were talking about, through learning. I'll say that one more time. The way of life of a group of people passed down from one generation to the next through learning. So there's many definitions of culture, but they often share some of these features. The way of life is sort of how we do things here, right? What is understood to be normal here? The group of people is to say that culture has to be shared, right? There's no individual people don't have culture. Culture only happens in relationship to others, right? So culture is something between people, between individuals, between groups, right? Between subgroups, subcommunities, between communities, between, you know, nations, in companies, there are cultures, right? So any group of people in lots of different contexts will have a broad kind of culture, but also multiple subcultures that will be sort of a part of that mix. And the idea of passed down from one generation to the next is to say that the thing about culture is it's that idea of tradition, that idea of legacy, right? It's something that sort of continues on over time. And it can also change over time. So the only thing I would critique about Weaver's definition, he would love me for this, who's always good for a critique, is it's not just passed down passively. Culture is something that also changes. We struggle with it. New generations grapple with it and change it, right? So we understand the sort of cultural ideas, the ways of life of those who came before, and we adopt and appreciate many of those, but we also grapple with them and transform them in different ways. And the last piece, this learning idea, is that culture is not something that we have at birth, right? It's something that we continue to be socialized into, right? That we are taught through human beings, explicitly and implicitly, through our institutions like education and through our religious groups that we're a part of, our political system that we're a part of, any company that we're a part of, right? All of those groups sort of teach us in explicit and implicit ways, the ways of being, what is valuable in that place. So another feature of culture I want to talk about, this is the proverbial cultural iceberg. If you graduate from SIS and haven't seen this iceberg, you're in big trouble. But the thing with the iceberg is sort of a way of understanding culture. I think that's really important. And it helps us understand some of the words that you all kind of put in the chat box earlier. Culture has visible features and invisible features, right? And the bulk of culture is actually invisible. It's below the waterline, right? So like an iceberg, there are pieces you can see, but far more of it that you can't see, right? And the things on the top are actually cultural expressions of the things that emerge from the bottom, right? So things like language, manners, the arts, our institutions, religion, how we dress, the food we eat, our customs, our traditions, right? All of those things, our behaviors, our practices, those are all expressions of what and we can see them and hear them and taste them, right? But they're expressions of what is actually under the surface, which are one more layer deep, our beliefs, our ideals, right? The norms, the things we're used to, the things that everybody does, all right? The concepts like time, concepts like power, the roles, the way we understand roles and relationships and hierarchies or egalitarianism. These are all features of sort of the sort of next deeper layer of color of culture. And at the bottom sort of the iceberg are the deepest components of culture, which are our values. What is it we deeply value? And I would argue it's also how we prioritize our values. It's often not that cultures don't share the same values, they prioritize them differently. All right, I think that's a piece that I would add to this. And the desires, the things that we are taught to find desirable, the things that are worth wanting, I often say, are the things we've come to believe to be desirable and where that comes from. That's the deep part of it. You might see, you know, a way of being that is considered desirable, like a certain form of dress. We talk about this for the career folks out there, right? I wore my jacket for you today, right? That is it is a way of dress, right? That would be considered professional in a sort of Western US business context, right? But that emerges from something much deeper. It's not just a practice, it's connected to a set of values. In fact, I can see that this has lapels, right? Lapels typically, right, are cut for men, right? So that goes into deeper cultural ideas around who should be in professional settings, who's traditionally in professional settings. Are we thinking about why is everyone wearing same kinds of things? Is that related to our ideas around falling in line and hierarchy, right? So I'm using that just as an example. We could debate whether all these things are true, right? But that's an example of how there's a connection between what we see on the surface and the sort of deeper values, assumptions, attitudes, and beliefs that are driving what we see on the surface. So as we move into intercultural competence, this is really important. When these icebergs clash, and they do, because we're all floating around in an ocean, right? And we come into contact with each other. And when they clash, what we often see is where icebergs clash first is under the surface. But it's not always visible in behaviors, right? We can celebrate difference and diversity, right? We have big celebrations of cultural heritage and those sorts of things, right? Look at this, the behaviors are both up there. They don't appear to be clashing, right? We can have a big night where everybody shares food and shares cultural traditions and practices, and it's lovely. And I'm not saying those things aren't wonderful, they are. But often what they mask is actually a clash of something deeper under the surface, right? And so as we think about intercultural competence, it is often this ability to navigate effectively cultural interactions and cultural clashes, right? And to be able to see them and observe them, all right? So I'm going to get nerdy here. I'm putting up my academic nerdy hat. from the Intercultural Communication Program and talk a little bit about how communication operates across cultures, right? To help us understand a little bit more why intercultural competence matters, right? So as we said, any cultural group of, any group of people of which we're a part that has a tradition over time, right, is a culture. So we are all a part of many, many, many cultures, right? Your family is a culture, your nuclear family, your broader family may have a culture, the things you always do, the things you come to expect, right? The traditions you uphold, the values you all share. You know, your AU has a culture, your office has a culture, your nation and your ethnic group and some categorizations of racial groups and genders have sort of cultural practices, shared ideas, right? And to some degree, because we're all different, we all have a varied set of cultural backgrounds. Any interaction with anybody else is going to be a communication across cultures, right? But we all sit in these cultural fields. That's what I'm gonna call this in my nerdy way. And our cultural fields, if you imagine these two things I'm showing you as Venn diagrams, right? They can be closer or farther apart, right? So that overlap in the Venn diagram can be tighter or farther, right? Depending on the varied sort of cultural cultures and subcultures in which two individuals or two organizations or two nations are interacting, right? And what happens in a sort of communication context is that we as, and that can be me as Amanda, that can be we as American University, right? That can be we as the US. We send a message, right? We want to do something. We want to achieve a goal through communication. That could be to make a friend. That could be to land a business deal. That could be to build understanding with someone. That could be to get a client, right? That could be to have our identity received and understood by someone else, right? All of those are forms of communication. But what happens is we decide on what message we want to send within our cultural field. We encode that message within our cultural field, and then we send it across some form of channel, right? That channel could be our bodies, our voices, that channel could be media, that channel could be a letter, that channel could be a statement, that channel could be a business deal, right? So we're sort of connecting with the other, quote unquote, with the receiver of that in some way through the channel, right? That's how we're interacting. It could be from I bump into someone, right? That's the channel of communication. That's how we're connecting. Now, the thing is, the receiver is going to make sense of that message, decode it, right? Kind of like translate it within their cultural field using the tools and ideas and concepts that are all kind of situated in their cultural field, right? They're going to use those tools to try and understand the message you are sending and to receive it, right? And then based on what they understand, the receiver will send feedback back to the sender, right? And then this sort of continues on. So any interaction we have as individual human beings, as organizations, as communities, is to some degree a cross-cultural communication, right? And the goal of effective cross-cultural or the effective cross-cultural communication is to be able to have the meaning of the sender understood as much as possible by the receiver. Okay, that's kind of generally the goal, right? In a way that is respectful and appropriate and just, I would argue. Okay, so what does this mean then for intercultural competence? All this stuff I've been running my mouth about, right? What this means is that the world, as we all know, is getting smaller and smaller. Coronavirus has showed us more than anything, right? How small our world truly, truly is, right? And so we are interacting, maybe not physically anymore these days, right? But we are interacting more and more with people from cultural backgrounds that are unlike ours. That's a beautiful opportunity for all kinds of learning and for all kinds of new ideas. It's also a challenge because it's less and less likely now, right? As borders and boundaries have started to open and loosen, the ways that we connect over digital platforms, social media, right? That can be understood as a border that's loosening, the way that we're receiving and getting messages from all around the world in ways we never would have before. because of that, there's also likely to be more misunderstanding if we don't build what we understand to be intercultural competence. That is basically this capability to shift our cultural perspective, to go from this cultural field that we were raised in, right? And to shift as much as possible. You can never fully understand anybody else's culture. You never can. It's impossible, right? But you can basically use tools to try and shift as much as possible to the receiver's perspective, right? So that you can say, what was it that they meant, right? What did they mean to be saying here? What was the intention behind this, right? How can I best make that, it's called a cybernetic model. How can I best, how can we make sure that the message sent by the receiver is best, sent by the sender is best understood and most fully understood by the receiver, right? How can that happen? And intercultural competence is the ability to be able to see from the perspective of the cultural other, right? And appropriately communicate in that context, and then also adapt behavior to things that you share and things that are different, right? So I'm going to dig in more to what that means. But we talked a little bit about this. Before I do that, I want to just say like why this matters, right? So we talked about all these interconnections, right? But also we didn't talk about the way that we're also starting to fray as communities, as sub-communities. You know, we see increasing xenophobia, increasing nationalism, increasing racism, right? Increasing anti-Semitism. I mean, all of these sort of ways that we are fraying as a society, as a nation, as a globe, right? Across difference, right? So intercultural competence is a tool to be able to help us rebuild connectiveness, connective tissue, which is ultimately relationship, and it's ultimately trust. It doesn't change policy. It doesn't do all the other things we need to shift power, to be very clear, but it becomes a tool across which we can actually come to understand ourselves and each other more clearly, all right? That's why we need this, both to build interconnections and to navigate them, but also to help resist some of the fraying of those relationships that we've had over time. Also, again, intercultural communication matters because when you do it well, you don't only have a better society, right? That is more just, that is better able to meet everyone's needs to the extent we possibly can, but you're also able to come up with, you can work together, you can collaborate. And if we can't work together, we can't come up with new ideas, right? Whether that's in a business context, whether that's in the social context, like how do we come up with an idea in the US for addressing poverty, right? Or healthcare, right? We need to work together to do that. We don't all have to agree. And I want to be really clear, intercultural competence is not about agreement. It's about understanding, okay? We don't always have to agree to understand. Understanding is necessary, however, to actually disagree well, to disagree about the right things that actually move us forward and don't move us backwards in terms of our interconnections. And in a really concrete business context, right? Because many of you will want to talk about this to your employers, I imagine, and figure out how to apply it as employers and career functions. Intercultural competence, right? There are ways to measure it, which some of you know about the Intercultural Development Inventory. There are other sort of tools for intercultural competence we can talk about if you have questions. But when teams are more interculturally competent, they perform better, right? When organizations are more interculturally competent, they tend to hire more diverse talent. And folks who are at organizations tend to feel more seen and heard, and tend to feel more not only just included in an organization, but engaged in an organization. And people also tend to retain and be satisfied at their place of work, right? So nobody's ever measured empirically, is this true of an interculturally competent nation? But I think that's probably true. I think we can argue that like we can work together better. We can feel better about operating together if we understand each other's perspectives more clearly. And the other thing is, you know, employers really recognize this. The sort of future of work, and I'm sure that Gihan and Daniel and others can talk about this more than I can, but cross-cultural competence continually is identified as one of the key skills to be effective in the future, right? For all of the reasons that we can talk about later. You know, it's one of those, again, they call it a competency, but I would call it kind of a way of I would call it an adaptive skill, right? It's a way of navigating change that is necessary in our continually changing both workforce and world more generally. So another reason why intercultural competence is so important is because intercultural miscompetence, right? Incompetence is probably a better word, can have huge negative outcomes, right? On a light note, some of that can happen in businesses, right? So one example, I put up the Gerber baby here. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, but this is the brand this is the old sort of branding of a baby food and baby products company here in the US, right? You'll notice many things about this baby. She's maybe a she, I don't know, very sort of delicate features, white skin. You know, we can talk about all of those power relations of sort of representation there. But Gerber tried to expand to Africa. And they put this label on all their products. So not only was that culturally incompetent when you look at representation, right? But also the way that they framed it. They talked about how they used this phrase that went along with this, which is to say, the language was, your baby is well served if they eat Gerber. The way it translated into Kiswahili, it was understood as basically something entirely different, which is very inappropriate. So I won't say it out loud. But importantly, often in many, many African cultures, not all, but in many African cultures, it's common to put the image of what is actually in the product on the product. So it appeared as though this was actually you consuming a baby, right? So obviously that was terrible on many, many levels for the business. So on a very practical level, right? It doesn't work if you're not interculturally competent. Who understood enough about how African products are marketed? Who understood enough about how this would be received as this little white baby, right? Coming across Africa and the power dynamics and the impacts of that, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not going to go into all these other examples. I can later if you want, because we're short on time. But when it goes wrong, it goes really wrong, right? So ultimately, when we talk about intercultural competence, it's this capacity to learn to see from other people's perspectives, right? That's what we're really talking about. How do you learn to see from other people's perspectives and come to understand that what you're seeing, the way you see it, is not always the truth, right? It's your truth, but that doesn't mean it's the truth, right? So that's I think, a simple and very complicated way to talk through what it is that we're trying to do together. And the last thing, I'll say two more things about intercultural competence and then open it up for some questions and discussion. So often, we talk about kind of diversity and inclusion. We throw these words around, intercultural competence. I want to just sort of give a little bit of framing around how these things can be connected, right? When we talk about diversity, we're often talking about the who, right? Who is represented in an organization, in a community, in a nation, et cetera. Inclusion is kind of what these organizations, nations, communities do to make those who are there actually feel a part of that place. So it feels fully representative of all the ideas, perspectives, knowledges, wisdoms that are drawing from the diverse community. But how you get from diversity to inclusion is intercultural competence. That's how you start to kind of turn the dial from having lots of different kinds of folks with different ideas, backgrounds, lived experiences in an organization or a community to a community that operates to actually engage fully all of the experiences, vision, and knowledges of those folks. You need intercultural competence as the how that you get there, right? These are the tools you use to kind of build that. So we'll talk a little bit more about this in detail, but ultimately the intercultural competence, again, think about it as the how of DEI, right? It's the how we do it. And there's three pieces of it that we're going to talk about later. But I want to kind of just lay out, there's a couple of things it requires. It requires to be interculturally competent that we have a deep and ongoing awareness of our own culture, right? And how it shows up in our everyday interactions, in how we see and think and feel, and our interpretations. We have to come to understand that very, very clearly, because the thing about culture, right, is it's the water in which we swim. It's the air that we breathe, our own cultures. We can't often see them, right? because we're so that we're so used to them. So we don't often even understand all of the dimensions of our own cultures until we move out of our cultural frame of reference, right? Those are often the moments when we start to be able to build that cultural self-awareness. The other piece that it requires is building a deep understanding of the experiences of folks from other cultural communities other than your own, right? And remembering we all occupy many, many cultural communities, right? But really learning, and this is some of the work that folks can do on our own, right? It's you can read, there's so many amazing resources out there to build understanding of other cultural perspectives and experiences. This can sometimes happen in a friendship, right? This can sometimes happen in a relationship of other sorts. But building a deep understanding also is not building that on the backs of folks who often have to explain their cultural ways of being, especially if they're in what we would call a quote unquote subdominant culture, which is to say a culture whose lived experiences and identities and perspectives are not always seen, valued, and heard by those in power. Okay, so how do we build a kind of deep, rich, as we start to understand ourselves, we'll also start to understand our blind spots, right? What are we missing? What don't we know? Where are our gaps? And then we fill in those gaps, right? By learning, by reading, by traveling, by experiencing, by building deep and meaningful relationship with others from varied cultural backgrounds that are different from ours, right? So the piece though to understand is it's not just about what we know and think and understand in our heads, it's also what we can do, right? So how do we actually change then what we do? Some folks really understand cultures that are not their own, right? They can describe to you, let me tell you all the things that I know about, me, Amanda, let me tell you all the things that I know about Chinese culture, right? Because I've studied it, I haven't really, right? But I've studied it, I've been to China, I've lived there for 10 years, blah, blah, blah. I can describe it, let's say very well. I might have a cognitive understanding of it. But if you ask me to build a partnership for AU with a Chinese university, if I'm not able to actually change my behavior in a way that actually bridges those cultural differences that I understand, then I'm not fully culturally competent, okay? So there's a couple levels of intercultural competence, like we talked about, I want to say. Individual humans, so like me, Amanda, right? If I can be and work to become more interculturally competent, but also groups can become interculturally competent. So community organizations can become interculturally competent. For example, a department in an organization can become interculturally competent, right? And that is connected to, but not the same as, any individuals in that organization being interculturally competent. So I, as Amanda, might understand, what it means that I'm white, that I'm a woman, that I'm heterosexual, right? All the things. What might that mean? I might understand that, and I might understand kind of how that's different from being Black or Latinx or in a non-heterosexual relationship, et cetera. I might be able to understand that for myself, and I actually might be able to personally bridge across some of those differences when I interact with other people, right? But that doesn't mean that me, myself, even if I'm the executive director of an organization, right? It doesn't mean that my organization itself is interculturally competent just because I am. And I think leaders sometimes make that mistake of thinking, if I really think about these things, and this is something that I feel like I can do and I really pay attention to and I'm very intentional about, my organization will be so too. Or if our whole team of leaders is interculturally competent, we will all be. That's not true. The thing is, organizations have cultural histories that are separate from those who lead them in any moment and who behave in them. So it's why we have to think about the varied levels of intercultural competence, right? So individuals, subgroups, and then organizations or nations, right? So think about I think about like Google Earth, right? You're really close and you can zoom out, and intercultural competence looks and feels different, and you have to work on it in different ways, depending on the kind of level that you're describing, all right? And again, I always put in here that a reminder that intercultural competence is a practice, right? A growing awareness, self, other, quote unquote, awareness, doing things, learning from that, building new self-awareness, right? Deepening understanding of cultural groups that aren't mine or that aren't my own, and then trying a behavior again. That goes back to that feedback loop we talked about. Okay, that's how we learn in these areas. So like we talked about, there's sort of these three parts of intercultural competence. I put the heart, the head, and the hands, right? We've so far talked about the head, right, which is the knowledge, self and other knowledge. And we've talked about, we talked a little bit about some of the skills. What can I do? Can I listen across cultures? Can I speak across cultures, et cetera? But there's also attitudes. What are my inclinations? Where's my heart? What moves me and drives me? Okay, what are some of the things that I value? So intercultural competence, attitudes, knowledge, and skills are the three components. So you can think about it: heart, head, and hands as those three pieces. And what do we mean by when we say that? Attitudes are things like curiosity. You're actually earnestly curious to learn about folks who are not like you. You really want to know. And you're actually then open to hearing things about yourself and others that may be surprising and maybe sometimes uncomfortable. And that you also have an attitude for deep respect for difference, right? And you're not sort of doing this work to feel like you're better, but you're really trying to do it to learn how to more deeply respect yourself and others, right? And then knowledge, we talked about this, cultural self-awareness and cultural kind of quote unquote other awareness. And then some of the skills that are necessary are things like listening, observing, relating, evaluating, and acting, right? These are some of the these are some of the skills that you'll see, the kind of behaviors that folks will enact that all speak to their intercultural competence.